Are we still waiting?
No.
No? We can go ahead. Okay, hi guys. I'm Dennis. I'm from Singapore. For those of you who may not know me, I'm most well known through the website aquarics.com. The website focuses on articles on how to grow difficult picky species, and that is my main call to fame. For those of you who know, I think I'm more well known because of growing a couple of species, to be the first in the world to propagate a few species. So I was the first to grow Hygrophila chai. Before this, the farms could grow it immersed, but they didn't have a technique to grow it submerged. So after I discovered how to grow it submerged, I wrote the articles on how to grow it, so the farm could begin exporting it to the rest of the world. Some hobbies collect plants from the wild. So this Inoculum cuspidatum is collected from India, I think. But some of the collectors may not know how to grow such species underwater. So they'll give the species to me, then I'll find a way to propagate it, then I'll write the instructions on my website, then the plant spreads in the hobby. So for some of these species, I think they became a lot more widespread in the various countries after someone writes the instructions for them online. All these are done with CO2 though. So for those of you without CO2, some of these species will be very challenging to grow. So that is the topic of my talk today as well. Not just how to grow plants, but how do you grow the more challenging species. And I'll talk a little about defeating algae. Tommy didn't give me a time limit to the talk, right? So I prepared a presentation on plants and algae, but after this, we'll have one on aquascaping.
We have until 5, so take your time.
Yeah, so the format is that this talk will be, I think, about an hour. We'll take a short break. Then we'll have the aquascaping portion, which will be roughly about an hour as well. And if you guys still have free time and are here, we can do a bit of hands-on, because there's so much hardscape. It will be a waste not to try some stuff. So we do have a lot of time. So I'll cover the more important bits first. Then as it drags on to 2-3 p.m., those of you who are still here, we'll do something else. Okay, so let's start. How to grow challenging plants and defeat algae. I think the first aspect of growing difficult plants is that it can be hard to find good information. So when you go online and Google, there's always someone that's claiming that, oh, I did this and I get this result. But I think that there are a lot of what I call false positives online. So for example, when it comes to the idea of growing certain stuff without carbon dioxide injection, for example, carpeting plants, which I know everyone wants to do. If you Google online, can I grow a carpeting plant without CO2 injection? You will find successful examples. In fact, in the earlier years, I was one of the few that demonstrated that you can grow virtually all the carpets without carbon dioxide injection. However, that method is not a very stable one, depending on the parameters of your tank and substrate. And I would say that for most of the time, when people try to grow carpets without carbon dioxide, they fail. So the success rate of that methodology is low. What I want to talk today is methods that give good success rates. So if you will, I want to talk about methods that are more optimized. So you do not need to hit every parameter that I described. But I'll say that if you do, the success rates are greatly amplified, especially when it comes to difficult species. A lot of hobbyists like to talk about what works for them, but what works for me may not work for other people. So I'd rather talk about what works for the average person out there. And I have data on this because after starting 2 Hour Aquarius, I sell a uniform product line across 30 different countries. And many of the people in the different countries will ask me, oh, I want to replicate the tanks you have. What can I do? So I came up with a standard instruction set that I can tell these people, these are my tanks. And my success can be replicated in other countries quite easily. So these are folks from the Middle East, Philippines, more Middle East, and some are Europeans as well. The interesting thing about the methodology is that it doesn't require great scientific knowledge. So for example, I know that some of these folks, they don't even know the difference between GH and KH. Right? So they don't do much measurements in their tanks. They just follow kind of like a few simple steps given to them, and they can grow virtually any difficult plant. So you do not need a great science background to just grow picky plants. You kind of just need I call it the criteria, which is what I will be telling you guys today. Yeah, so this guy from the Philippines, I think by now he owned test kits. When he first started, I think he didn't own any test kits. Yeah. And I still don't think he knows the difference between GH and KH. Yeah, but he can grow any plant on the market you see today. I'll start with the first idea, introducing new plants to a tank. I think for those of you who have anyone who have had a tank has this plant milting syndrome. So what causes plant milting? It is chiefly caused by plants adapting to the new environment. Why do plants need to adapt? Let me tell you how to put this. When a plant grows in an environment, it will sense the light conditions, the water parameters, and the new growth that it produces will try to optimize for that environment. However, when you change the environment, the plant will sense the different environmental variables and then program a different set of enzymes and proteins to make use of the new environment. And depending on how different the environment is, sometimes the programming goes haywire and you get milting. So one species that tends to milt a lot when adapting to a new environment is the Bucephalandra. And it's interesting because this plant is actually very easy to grow. You can grow it without CO2, you can grow it with low light and low nutrients. However, when you change the environment, because it is sensitive, it tends to milt. And one important takeaway point is that the new growth is programmed to the new environment that you sit the plant in. And these new leaves are the ones that will be optimized to the new environment. And the plant will shape basically its older leaves. If we take a difficult species, Hygrophila chai, so I put it into a new tank, you see that the old leaves start to rot, but the newest growth is fresh colored, it's strong, and this will be the growth that is programmed for the environment of the tank. However, if you keep changing the tank environment, then the programming doesn't stop. So the plant doesn't get a chance to basically adjust, and that will cause continual milting. And for many challenging species, that's the way that you lose the plant. Yeah, so I guess the first lesson here is that once you set up a tank and get your parameters dialed in, it's important to keep it stable so that the plant can settle in. If you keep tweaking your parameters, whether is it fertilizer or hardness levels, then the plant cannot adjust. This is an example of a plant I took back from the shop. After the plant was put in the tank, the new growth is nicely colored, good coloration. This is the whole growth that was grown when it was in the shop. But even though this plant has been put into my tank, the old growth does not heal. So the next idea is that for plants, they can grow new leaves, but they don't have the ability to regenerate old ones. So old growths do not adapt and old growths do not heal. So the plant's strategy will always be to produce new growth that is optimized for the environment, but it will sacrifice its old growth. So there's nothing we can do to save it. Right? So for this plant, what will happen in the long run is that I will cut off this top, I will replant it, and then I will throw away all the old growth. And if we extrapolate this idea, let's say you have a tank that is fully grown, but you change the parameters very suddenly. So the plants will produce new growth that adapt to the new parameters. But basically all the growth that has been existing in that tank previously will be sacrificed. And sometimes if you do this across the whole tank, your tank can crash. Yeah, because all your old growth will deteriorate at the same time, you'll get a huge algae spike. I think that's why folks they are used to doing their tanks in a certain method are very resistant to change. Because once they change something, they realize that quite often the tank goes downhill and they cannot pull it back. However, there is a method to combat this. So we'll talk about it in the following slides. So when you start the tank, how do you growing a tank quickly. In this example, this tank was grown in about 40 days. That will be about 6 weeks. So there are two ways to start the tank very efficiently. One is that you have a slightly matured tank. That means you do a dark start. A dark start will be one where you add the substrate, you run a filter, preferably a matured filter, run it for 2 weeks before you do any planting. Do any of you guys do that method? Dark start? Yeah.
Actually,
yeah. So some of you do know. The other method that does work, but is labor intensive, is to do very regular water changes. So this is like a flowing river is always renewed. And that is what I did for this tank. I changed water every day for the first 2 weeks. Then for the third week, I changed water every 2 days. Then for the fourth week, I changed water every 3 days. Then for the fifth week onwards, it's just regular weekly water changes. And that will allow your tank to skip the algae-free phase completely. But it does require more work. For competition aquascapers that do aquascapes that they need complete within 3 months, this is what they usually do as well. Very frequent water changes. So why does very frequent water changes work? It removes organic debris. And I think that it also removes the excess pathogenic bacteria in a new tank. But what we do know for certain is that the method works.
What percentage are you changing?
No, I'm changing 80% of the water.
80%?
Yeah, so it's a huge water change. It's like, you know, the fish breeders that do 100% water changes every day. Yeah, it's like resetting the system. Yeah. But the caveat to this is that your tap water source needs to be stable. So if it is unstable, then this method may not work so well, right? Because then you get spikes in your parameters. And an example of a plant that is actually quite easy to grow, but doesn't take well to a new tank is UG. Have any of you tried this? No? Not a popular plant here. It's a nice carpeting plant because it grows very dense. And it has this like light green, very nice green tone. I've seen professional aquascapers fail with this as well because they will plant it in a fresh setup. Like, you know, people like to do demos in aquascaping where they put the soil, then they plant the plants. That's actually the worst way to start a tank. Like, it looks good for videos, it looks good for YouTube, but it's very, very unstable. A better way would be to let the tank mature for a couple of weeks before you plant the more delicate plants. This is Lauriga Pantanal. This is also Lauriga Pantanal, but grown with weaker conditions. So the next thing I want to talk about is parameters. Parameters to growing the more difficult species. So what makes a plant difficult? Some of them require more light, more CO2, more fertilizer. Some of them may require things like soft water. And there are some species that are more sensitive, like the previous slide. The plant is not very high demand, but it's sensitive to changes. This is an example of a plant that likes the high light, high CO2, high fertilizer. And if it doesn't get what it requires, it will look like this. Yeah. So it's a classic example of a high demand plant. Hygrophila chai is also a high demand plant. If you don't have enough light and fertilizer, then it can multiply, but it doesn't look as good. Example of species that require soft water. Many Eurocolons fall under that category, and many of the Bonilla species. For soft water species, this is a hard cutoff. That means you either can grow it or you can't because you don't have the water. Once your KH rise above 3, many of these species, you just can't grow it. So it's a non-negotiable line in the sand for soft water. On the flip side, there are some species that do better with hard water. So these are two examples. The Cryptocoryne Flamingo and Florida, they do better with higher calcium levels in the water. Do any of you know this? No? Yes. Some. Yeah. When Flamingo first appeared on the market and people did not know how to grow it, many mistook that it required salt water. After we discovered that it actually does better with harder water and we publish the results, then people flip the methods. Then they realize that, oh, once you have higher calcium levels, it's a very easy plant to grow. You can even grow this without carbon dioxide injection, but the color will be less intense. And these are a couple of examples of species that are sensitive. So this will include many of the, I call them mutations. So these plants don't occur in the wild. They occur as hybrids. They are done in the lab or done where people crossbreed species. So these are two weird, I think less seldom seen ones, the medium butterfly and the rotala bee type two. So this one is really weird. It has this curved leaves as a characteristic. Species that are sensitive, they like extreme stability in the tank. They don't like movements in either your dosing or CO2 or light. And many sensitive species, they're actually best grown in tanks with, I would say, a medium level of light rather than an extremely strong level of light. Extremely strong level of light drives growth, but for sensitive species, driving growth hard sometimes causes them to mutate and change. Yeah, but I think that fewer people grow these plants. Have you grown this, Tom?
What?
Which one?
The butterfly.
Did it go well?
For a while until I moved and then I kill everything.
So the interesting thing about the butterfly is that it morphs into what we call a caterpillar if you don't grow it well. So the leaves will become totally green and they'll be rounded. So it looks nothing like this plant when it reverts. Okay, so these are the steps that I'll walk you guys through. What are the parameters that work generally well for this difficult set of plants? Then I'll talk a little bit about getting really good CO2 levels, which is one of the most important factors when you try to acclimatize difficult species. Then I'll talk a bit about maintenance and algae, because these two are very closely tied. Then we can look at some of Tommy's tanks and you guys can shit on them. Nah, I think his tanks are done quite well. Like they're generally clean. Yeah, I think he runs one of the most well-maintained shops I've seen in the US so far for planted tanks. So you guys have to give some props to him. Yes. This is one of my farm tanks back at home. This set of parameters, they are not written in stone. So you can deviate quite a bit from it and still find good success. But across the different countries, from what I've observed, this is a very, quite the sweet spot. So if you hit it squarely, your chances of success do increase. For water hardness, having 2 DKH and below is good. So you can even use like 0, like pure RO will be 0. However, we want to pair that with a GH that is a bit elevated. And this is a weird combination. So this combination rarely exists in nature. In nature, when your GH is high, you tend to have a corresponding high KH. Because in nature, how you get high GH is that the water flows through limestone and you get both carbonates as well as calcium. To get this, it requires us to artificially add chemicals that raise the GH but does not move the KH. Yeah. So an example of using RO water and then using a GH booster to raise the GH but keeping the KH at 0. So this is a bit of an odd combination, but this combination works great for across almost all the species that I can think of. The pH is actually not important. So whether you are at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, it's fine. And your pH will be below 7 if your pH is that low. So those two go hand in hand. The temperature, I think that this is the sweet spot. There's a little bit of range to it. You can go slightly lower, but I think below 70, the plants grow very slowly. And above 80, it's harder to control algae. So the sweet spot will be between 70 to about 76. Then next is the light. Have you guys heard of this term called PAR? Yeah, so most of you know. To cut the long story short, PAR is I think the most accurate measurement of what light is available to the plant at. at a surface. So I have with me this is a power meter. Later we'll use this. Then we can check out how much blood Tommy uses on his tanks. Yeah. So it comes out in a number. So when people say they have 50 par in their tank or 100 par, this is the number that they are referring to. With today's lighting, I think a lot of tanks tend to err on having too much light. Yeah. So if any of you buy lights from Tommy, his lights are very powerful. So if you run them on a standard size tank, you'll get actually double this value. So I think himself, you tune down the light as well. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. For most of your tanks, you will use less than 100%. I'll say that this is the sweet spot, because if you go much higher than this, let's say you have a tank with 400 pounds in the substrate, the plants will grow well, but it gets difficult to control certain algae types. And if you fall below this, then you might not get the coloration of growth from some of the species. So I'll say that between 100 to 200 is the sweet spot for management. For TDS, it's not very important for plant growth wise. Depending on what I have in my tanks, it can range from 100 to like 300. So the range is very wide. What fertilizer to use? I think that this topic is one that everyone on the internet like to discuss at great length.
APT.
Yeah. Yeah. So I manufacture and sell APT, but you do not need to use my products to get any of these results. For those of you who, because a lot of you are from the US, you will have heard of this term called EI, right, from Tom Bach. So it's a dosing method that basically there's a program of like dosing this amount of nutrients across a week. And basically EI tend to saturate the water quite heavily with nutrients. So the central idea is that you dose everything in excess, so that at no point in time does any plant lack for nutrients. It's a bit of a heavy-handed method, but it does work. Whether to dose more or less depends on whether you are growing this family of plants. So what is Lytracia? Lytracia refers to all the species in Rotala and Armania. So if you are growing this species and you dose very heavy water column fertilizers, it can stunt their tips. So they will become like this. So this is an example that is grown well, and if you dose too much fertilizer, the tip stunts, and in some cases it dies off. And this can apply to too much nitrates, too much trace elements. Those are the two main culprits. And in some cases, too much potassium. Yeah. This is the well-grown narrow-leaf Macandra. Again, if you overdose, you get this. You can even get this on Rotala rotundifolia, but usually the only people that can get this are people that mix their own fertilizer, the DIY fertilizer users. No commercial brand can stun Rotala rotundifolia into this form. So how much to dose? Let me give you an example of what the EI dosage will be. And this is the dosage level that the EI would dose in a week. They will dose about 20 parts per million potassium, 20 parts per million nitrates, and let's say 5 parts per million phosphates. So they will divide up this amount and then depend on whether you want to dose it daily or every couple of days. You can grow the tank in a very wide range. So for example, in this tank, I'm dosing about 2 parts per million potassium per day, and the nitrates and phosphates follow that ratio. But I can also dose it like 5 times as much, and the tank will look roughly the same, but it will grow much faster. So in terms of fertilization, I think that there's a lot more room for error than folks will like. I think that there's too much argument online about the exact amounts of dosing, whereas most plants, they are okay as long as you keep the dosing rate stable. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people turn back to thinking about fertilizers when something goes wrong, when actually it is something else that goes wrong. The idea that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail, because that's all they can analyze. I think planter tanks are very complex, there are a lot of biological components to it, like CO2. Even the intra-plant competition affects the growth of species. But online discussions tend to be too narrowly focused just on nutrients, whereas most plants tend to be very flexible on the nutrient angle. What substrate to use? Tying in with this whole fertilizer dosing is that if you use a rich substrate, it gives you a lot more leeway in your water column. So I think that for picky species, aqua soil is the clear choice. You can use raw soil, like garden soil or topsoil, but because it is a non-uniform product, it's a bit harder to advise people on how to pick raw soil. Aqua soils work well because they contain ammonium and nitrogen, and for most plants, they prefer to use ammonia as a source of nitrogen compared to nitrates. And it gives less water column juggling. I think Tommy had a tank where you grew in with no water column fertilization, right?
Yeah. It's like 8 months and I don't have to dose anything at all.
Then you tell people, then they don't do it. So using a rich substrate, this is, I think, it's a very big factor for picky species. It gives you a lot of leeway for errors and other things. So this is an example of Lamiga senegalensis when you feed it ammonium nitrogen. So the leaves are much thicker and the red pattern is much fuller. And these are the ones typically you see grown when the substrate is inert or depleted. You see that there's a lot higher contrast in the veining, but the green areas are much more pronounced, and the leaf is much smaller and thinner. So, yes?
Would having fish animals in the tank provide that kind of ammonia?
Yes. So the downside of providing ammonia through the water column is that it's not as consistent. Like your filter digests it, right? And the downside of water column dosing is that all plants have equal access to it. So the most aggressive plants will snatch out what they can. Whereas for substrate, everyone has their own patch. So a plant that is less aggressive grower, he only has access his own soil that cannot be taken away by the other more aggressive plants. If you dose on a linear regime, you'll realize that a lot of the nitrogen can be taken up like within a 12-hour window. Yeah. As an example, let's say your tank is this densely planted and you dose 10 ppm of nitrates in the tank. The tank in a 24-hour window can uptake about 7 parts per million of it. Yeah. So within 2 days, this tank will drain 10 parts per million of nitrates. That is if I was dosing 10 parts per million. What if I dose 2 parts per million? Right. So within a 12-hour window, all the more aggressive plant will take it up, and then the more delicate or slower growing species, there's nothing left for them. So that is the other advantage of soil. Everyone gets their little pocket that they can feed off. But good question. And to add on to that, if you have a lot of fish producing significant amounts of ammonium and nitrogen, it does contribute. So your plants that do feed off that grow better with ammonium and nitrogen, they will grow better. Yeah. But having a lot of organic waste is also a trigger for algae. So that's the counterbalance. This is an interesting contrast because this tank has very high water column dosing. You know whose tank is this? You recognize it? Greg.
Great. Okay.
So this guy, he does EI in the water column. So he has about 15 ppm of nitrates, 20 ppm of potassium, 7 ppm of phosphates. Very, very high nutrient levels. But you still see the stunted tops because this guy is using inert substrate. So these are grown in my tank. My water column nitrates measure 0 because I dose very lean in the water column. 0 ppm nitrates in the water column. My potassium levels are below 10. My phosphates are about 0.5. But I still get these very full crowns. But that's because of the very rich soil beneath it. But in most tanks, it doesn't happen that way. In most tanks, there's I call it a tough trade-off. It's either that you inject it in a low level, and it takes very long to saturate the tank, or you inject it at a high level, but then after a while you find that your fish is gasping because you have exceeded the threshold. So most tanks kind of fall into these categories. Whereas if you inject too low, it can take like 6 hours to saturate the tank. And if you inject at a very high rate, you hit good levels in 2 hours, but then your fish start suffering thereafter. So how do we press this curve down? And we press this curve down by actually having more off-gassing. So I think we can go and look at Tommy's tanks, because he uses skimmer on all of his. So when he has this overflow and the water is splashing violently downwards, so this tank has like great oxygenation. And I think all the CO2 in the water will be driven out by that. So there are two things that gives good off-gassing. One is that you have a clean water surface. So Tommy uses surface skimmers on all his tanks. Is it? Is it all your tanks?
Yep.
Yep. So same as me. We will all have a surface skimmer to keep the top clean. His one is not working so well. So you see a bit of the surface film. This surface film actually comes from the plants. Right. So you'll see this a lot in the faster growing tanks compared to the low-tech tanks. For a lot of the low-tech tanks, you don't see this. But tanks that you drive the growth speed fast through strong light, carbon dioxide injection, they produce a lot of waste metabolites as the plants grow, and this gather on the surface. So this actually doesn't come from fish. You can have a tank with no fish and you still get a surface film. The surface film prevents the gaseous exchange, so both oxygen from getting in and carbon dioxide from getting out. So the surface skimmers are the way to get rid of that. The next is that the gaseous exchange only happens at the surface water. So the water needs to contact air. So it only happens at this very top layer. To get gaseous exchange going well for the whole tank, you need to circulate this top layer with the deeper layers in this tank. And that's why most commercial outlets tend to eject the water at the top rather than the bottom. So the flow pattern that they will try to achieve is that it pushes this column of water to the side downwards. So the circulation pattern is like this. For certain tanks that hobbies set up where the circulation pattern is just like this, so the top stays the top and the bottom stays the bottom, that tank doesn't have good gaseous exchange. Yeah. So this is I'll say this is the more ideal flow pattern for tanks that inject carbon dioxide. You have the outlet that is near the surface to push the water in this circular pattern. Yeah, the surface skimmer is not really working, but otherwise this is the same setup that I'll use in my tanks.
I'll fix it.
Yeah. Very attentive to your tanks. Sometimes the surface film can be a sign of negative changes in the tank itself. Yeah. Okay, we can hit that. The good off-gassing in your setup, you can actually inject a lot and your CO2 levels don't build. Yeah, so I think that whenever that folks say that their fish is gasping, rather than ask them to inject less, I would rather them improve their gaseous exchange. If you have good gaseous exchange, it takes a lot of CO2 to gas your fish. Like the bubbles you see will be at a rate that you cannot count. Yeah. High bubble counter rate. Before I get on to this point, how do you test that you have high levels of CO2 in your aquarium? Drop checkers, they function, but their error ratio is quite wide. So I would recommend having 1 pH drop. So what is a 1 pH drop? Let's say if I was to take a sample of Tommy's tank water, and his pH now is 5, because his CO2 is on, and I stir that water or I shake it to off-gas all the CO2, I should see the pH rise 1 point. Yeah. So for his farm tank that we saw just now, my guess is that his pH will be about, let's say, 5.6. If I took a sample of his water, put it in a cup, and stir it vigorously, I'll see the pH rise to about 6.6. So it will swing 1 full point of pH. So this works as long as your pH is below 10. Between 1 to 10, a 1 pH drop will give you approximately 35 to 40 ppm of CO2. So for my tank, the pH drops to 5. Without CO2, the pH is 6. when CO2 is on and saturated, the pH drops 1 full point to 5. 5 is still okay for most saltwater livestock. If your pH drops into the low 4s, then there is little cause for concern. But I think that's rare. I think for some folks, the amount of bubbles that they require to get this 1 pH drop can be quite shocking. Yeah, because I think most tanks out there, they actually run with much lower CO2 levels, between 15 to about 20 parts per million. And most plants will actually grow in those levels. So hitting the high levels is, I'll say, it's an optimization for growing a more difficult species. After the difficult species has acclimatized to your tank, it may actually survive at a lower CO2 injection level. But some species, such as the red eel, if you do not have a 1 pH drop, your chances of growing it is greatly diminished. So this is one of the best CO2 indicators out there. If it grows, you have good CO2 levels. If it doesn't, the chances are your CO2 is low. Also, this me feeding cassulatum to the guinea pigs at the shop. So we grew so much of it that we threw the ones that were not doing so well away. At one point, I think like Tomba was selling this for 100 USD per blood. Oh, the next thing I'll talk about is maintenance and algae. Right. So the thing about growing the more picky species is that you'll be blasting it with a bit more light, and unless your tank is well maintained, that almost always translates into algae. So the difficult part about growing difficult plants is not so much having the parameters, right? Because for us to have a lot of light, for us to grow fertilizer, that's the easy part. The difficult part is maintaining the tank in good form while running these parameters so high. And there are a few things that we do. One is that we remove old growth. Remember at the start of the talk when I talked about how plants acclimatize to the tank. As over time, as your tank changes, the new growth will be programmed to the current setting of the tank. But the old growth will tend to deteriorate, and the old growth does not heal. And the old growth is what usually attracts algae. So as part of the maintenance regime, we actually want to remove all of them. And this is the part that is, I think, tedious about maintaining an algae-free tank. How do you remove all the old growth? Trimming off the old leaves is one. Siphoning off the detritus at the substrate bottom is the next thing. And lastly is this idea about clean soil. So clean soil is a very weird concept. I think that, hands up if any of you have heard of this before. Okay, so yeah, it's new. So this is the people that grow the sensitive plants in the hobby worldwide all know about this. But I realized that it's just like known among the like 0.1% of people. And it's a very weird idea, right? Because soil is like dirt and clay and organic material. So what the hell is clean soil? For sensitive species, the buildup of organic material from the dying leaves and fish organic waste actually interferes with the formation of the roots. For some species such as Rotala, Kundalensis, clean soil is actually one of the criteria to growing this well. And it's a very weird concept for people who have not thought about it. So basically, clean soil is aqua soil in which you have removed off the finer bits. And that's because the excess of organic material affects the root growth. The exact mechanism, we are not entirely sure, but among the top growers in the world, we are very clear on this point. So everyone from Tomba to myself, to Marian in Romania, all of us would periodically vacuum the soil lightly to remove the excess detritus. For many picky species, this is actually quite important, but only the people that grow the picky species know about it. I think for a lot of the commercial aquascapers, they will tell you that, oh, I don't vacuum my substrate or I don't remove detritus from the substrate. But it works a lot for the difficult plants, and it also keeps the tank more algae-free. Yep. So this idea of clean soil, very strange concept, but yeah, it works. I'll talk a little bit about algae. So this is one of the tanks that I have at the gallery back home. I was impatient, so I planted the tank before cycling it. So you get this diatoms and spot algae on the plants as well.
Can you go back to that slide? See, you have the film on top too. I'm not the only one.
Yeah, the skimmer is not functioning well. Unoptimized setup.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a very common scenario. Everyone who has a planted tank has kind of seen this before. I think like diatoms, unless you are doing the exact steps that I described before, it always happens. Like there's a standard diatom phase in the second week of the tank, and if you are successful at letting the tank settle in, it disappears. But quite often you'll get spot algae. Again, we come back to the concept of this whole plant adaptation, right? So when I first shifted the plants in, the new leaves are programmed to the new environment, and the new leaves will have these defensive chemicals that prevent algae from attaching. The plant will likely draw energy from its old leaves, and it will stop defending its old leaves. So all the algae will be on the old leaves, but the new leaves will be killed. And the way to get an algae-free setup is to keep the new leaves, but remove the old ones by whatever method is necessary. So I will cut out the old leaves. And for the stem plants where the bottoms are deteriorating, I would uproot the whole plant, cut the top, replant the top, discard the bottom. And I will keep doing this week after week. So this is one more week. Plant mass has improved, but there's still algae. And then 1 week, when the balance is tilted towards the plants, the tank cleans itself up in that sense. Yeah. So all the old leaves that had algae will cut away, and I just keep replanting the top growth. So about 6 weeks later, this is the tank I get. For this example, I didn't change any parameters. I dose my fertilizers daily, and also I did not use any algicide. So for most tanks, I think that this is the baseline of how you should fight algae, by keeping the new growth that is healthy and adapted to the tank, and then you get rid of the old growth. It takes quite a bit of horticultural work, but to me it's the cleanest method because you don't use any algicide, you don't do anything else that affects the tank ecosystem. So just trimming and replanting. For big tanks, this is a lot of work, but it works. So this method of getting an algae-free tank is what I call fighting algae through plant mass. Yeah. So all these plants are producing the defensive chemicals in the new leaves. So if you have your entire tank filled with plant mass, it's like having a very well-planted field of grass. The weeds cannot get in. However, yes?
Sorry, will you be going over the propagation and trimming in general? Or for stem plants, I have a hard time knowing, where to cut, how deep to plant, that kind of thing.
Okay. For stem plants, the leaves and roots both appear from the internodes.
Yeah.
Right. So the internode is where let's see if I have a picture. The internode is where the leaf meets the plant. Yeah. Let's say you take a top portion, the internodes at the bottom where you buried it is where the roots will come out from as well. And the minimum requirement for a plant to grow is to have one internode for the leaf and one for the root. So you think about it, the shortest you can cut this plant is actually this length.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If you have a perfect sample and like good growth conditions, you can propagate this plant from like half an inch. But for most cases, you will want about 2 to 3 inches. Yeah, because what will happen after you cut the top of the plant is that and planting the substrate, the plant will not have any roots. You will have to draw the energy from that stem to grow roots and start adapting. Yeah, so you want a certain length. I think 2 to 3 inches is a very safe length for any species. Even for the big ones like we got planted now, 2 to 3 inches will work.
Would you remove the leaves that are being buried?
Oh yes,
Obviously,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. So that is for stem plants. For aerial, the way to propagate them is to split them down the center with a razor blade. Yeah, so you split it in half. both half will start to propagate baby plants. Then you can pick those off and plant them. So that technique is very specific for vibrios. For the other bigger species like the flamingos, this naturally propagate through runners. So you see the baby plants coming out by the side. For this, I'll just cut off the older leaves. Yeah, so these are actually the easiest to trim because you just cut off the outer layers. And if your plant is getting too big, you can cut off all the leaves, let it regrow from the small ones. Yeah. Oh, here you can see the internodes. So you see all the new shoots are sprouting from the internodes. Here. Alright, so coming back to this example. This tank depends on plant mass to fight off the algae. But what do we do when there are tanks that are sparsely planted? Right, so you don't have plant mass. So when the algae sees this, it's like, you know the meme, this free real estate. So this all this empty space that algae can invade, and there's nothing to defend against it. So how do we do this? If some people have tried applying the farm tank techniques to the aquaponics. So this is what happens when you dose EI into a sparsely planted tank. Your plants will grow, but chances are you get the algae on the rocks. What we actually want is something like this, right? So how do you get this rather than this? That is the question, essentially. And the answer is moving your N and P into the substrate. What we mean by moving N and P into the substrate is that we will use aqua soil, and then we will purely substrate feed those plants nitrogen and phosphorus. We only dose potassium and the other elements into the water column. N and P will purely be available from the aqua soil substrate. The other things that will work is to use slightly lower light levels and substrate feed the plants instead of dosing into the water column. So Tommy has actually quite a good example for the awagumi, where he just has a carpet and a few rocks. So that is one of the tanks where if he used the new soil, I think he could grow it without dosing for a few months. The commercial company that pioneered this method, I would say, is the ADA. I think all of you would know about it. They invented aqua soil, I think, in the 90s. So that allowed them to substrate feed their plants while maintaining a lean water column. So it allows all this kind of design. Yeah. So you look at how little plant mass this guy has. If we have tanks that have some hardscape, so I call this 50-50 tanks. We have some hardscape, but one colorful plants. So what do? Do you dose more? Do you dose less? I think if you want to keep your substrate clean, the method will still be to move more N and P into the substrate, and then dose less into the water column. I think these are actually the hardest form of tanks to maintain compared to the other two formats. So in the next slide, I will contrast this. If you have a very fully planted tank, you can use a lot of light and you can use a lot of nutrients in the water column, and the tank can still remain algae-free. So this is the plants keep algae away method. I call this plant dominance. However, for this to work, you need about 80 to 100% of your substrate to be planted. Once you fall below that, on the spots that are not planted, they become vulnerable to algae. This allows you to use a lot of light, a lot of fertilizer, and this is why this is the format that is used most commonly to grow the difficult species. However, if you're on the opposite end and you have no plant mass at all, you kind of have to use lower light, and then you have to shift your nutrients into a substrate. And this format is not good for growing the challenging species. And that's why you almost never see a successful awagumi that grows like the Irrecolon and the difficult species, because the methodologies don't match. And our style of tank, there are very clear trade-offs to it. We cannot both grow, you know, like for fishes, you won't keep an African cichlid with a saltwater fish, right? Because one needs alkali, one needs salt water. It's kind of the same with plants. If you want to grow very difficult species, you kind of have to do this style of tank. because you're going to be blasting a lot of light, you're going to have more fertilizer. If you have a lot of hardscape, your hardscape won't be clean. You won't have enough plant mass to keep the algae at bay. However, if you have very little plant mass, and we choose the easier plants to grow, then we can use much less light. We can shift the nutrients into the substrate, and we can keep the tank algae-free quite easily as well. The difficult ones are the tanks in the middle. The tanks where people say, I want some hardscape, or I want some red plants, and I also want the carpet. However, I think most people's tanks fall into the middle. And that's why I think a lot of folks have this difficult thing on balancing the tank. How much light to use, how much nutrient to use. And depending on how much substrate and what plants you grow, the variations that you can have is a lot. Tanks in the middle, I think they work best with a mix of both strategies. So what do I mean by a mix of both strategies? One is that it is still good to shift your N and P into the substrate. So if you can, use aqua soil and dose of fertilizer that is less heavy in nitrogen and phosphorus into the water column. Then use as little light as you can to get the coloration you want. So for this tank, I grew this in using about 180 par, but I think that it can be achieved by using just 100. And this will reduce the algae buildup on the hardscape. And if you're doing this kind of hybrid tanks where it's 50% hardscape, I think that you should avoid the most picky plants. Because it will be quite troublesome to keep both the picky plants as well as the hardscape team. So that is the trade-off. Yeah. But I do think that for most of the aquascapers, their tank actually fall in the middle. So they'll be doing a balance between I want bright light but not too bright. I want to dose a little in the water column but not too heavily. And for our tanks in the gallery that do this style, it will be the default bottle of ABD3 that we use. So this is the fertilizer line that we sell the most of. Because I think most aquarists, their tank fall in the middle. This tank can use EI, so this tank can use much higher nutrient levels. And this kind of tank will use our APT0, which has no nitrogen or phosphate in its formula, just potassium, magnesium, and the other elements. Yeah. You use EI on your iwagumi. Oh, but you're growing the...
Yeah. You floated to cover most of the light.
Okay, some practical examples. So for this tank, I think there's no guessing, right? So this tank would be under the scale of having more plants, and we can go the method of dumping a lot of light, a lot of fertilizer. As long as I can keep removing the old growth, I can keep this tank algae-free. So it's a lot of work, but the method to success is also very clear. All these are stem plants. So at some point in their life cycle, they have to be uprooted. The old growth has to be thrown away. I will clean the soil, then I will replant the top growth.
How do you clean the soil?
Sorry?
How do you clean the soil?
Vacuum.
Vacuum. Or they sell the dirty dusters. I will use it to agitate the top edge, and then I will vacuum off the detritus using the water cycle. Yeah. It's just that. There's nothing more. Okay, so for you guys, on a scale of 1 to 10, how fully planted will you categorize this? Will you categorize this as 50% planted or 60%?
50 probably. 40?
50? 40? Yeah. So if I went on the internet and I asked this guy to describe his tank to me, quite often a person with this kind of tank would say that, oh, my tank is quite fully planted. But when I look at the picture, then I'm like, no, this falls under the less than 50% planted. So this guy cannot use the strategy of plant dominance, or rather he cannot use it purely. He needs to be, his tank is somewhere in the halfway mark, where you cannot just blast the light and fertilizers. So his sand has already turned green from the light and the nutrients. So this is actually quite a tough tank to balance. On one hand, it doesn't have enough plant mass to be on that side. And yet, because you want to grow some red plants, he cannot use the super low light of the other end. So this tank, 40%.
20,
20,
30.
Tommy is me. So again, this is one of the tanks where I ask the guy, is your tank quite fully planted? And he will say, oh, I have a very fully planted tank, I have many species. But when I look at it again, the amount of substrate that is planted, I think it's about 25%. Yeah. And this guy doesn't use soil, right? So he doesn't have the option of moving the nitrogen and phosphorus into the substrate. So what you get is a lot of this dust algae. So just looking at this tank, my guess is that he's dosing quite a bit into the water column, but he does not have enough plant mass to defend his whole tank against algae. And because he doesn't have aqua soil, he doesn't have the option of just dosing less into the water column, right? Because this is an inert substrate. So this guy is caught between, he's caught between the rock and the hard place. I think that the strategy for this tank is to plant a lot more. Then he can do the full water column dosing method, and it will be okay. Yeah, so you cannot have a blank tank, and yet you still want to grow great plants. You still want to dose the water column heavily. So this is a combination that does not work. Like even with my skill set, I cannot make this tank algae free. I will have to tolerate the dust on the substrate and the dust on the glass. The plants may grow healthy, so the plants themselves can be algae free. But
I can make it.
Well, get algae.
I can make it algae free.
Oh, you can water change every day.
No,
Yeah.
just turn off the light.
But then your plants will die. Yeah. So how do competition aquascapers do this? So this is a scape by Aqua Rocks. All these are inert substrate. However, at the back, I'm quite sure that he has aqua soil. So the stems are planted in aqua soil portions at the back. For a competition tank, there's a brute force method that you can do. You can dose fertilizers into the water column in a moderate manner, but you do water change every other day. Yeah. So that will also keep the algae away if you have a lot of hardscape. So one way that this can be done is I dose water column nutrients. I water change every 2 days, and I do it for 3 months straight. So that will grow in the tank perfectly. I take the shot for the competition, then I let out the tank. I don't want to do the maintenance anymore. Yeah. So I'll say that for a lot of competition aquascapers, the brute force method to keep the tank algae free, it does work. And we can use that method to correct algae issues in our tanks as well. So for example, if you have a tank that is not doing well, and the plants are a bit weak, so because the plants are a bit weak, you want to dose a bit more nutrients, but you're worried about the algae getting out of hand. The way is to do more water changes, siphon away the detritus, remove old growth, and you can work your way through it. This is an example at my gallery back at home. A lot of open sand. I have soil at the back. So for this one, I did use the strategy of moving the nutrients into the substrate as well. And for the rest of the species that are in sand, they don't need much nutrients to survive. So that works for this. The other method that I can use for this tank is that rather than use even light coverage, so this tank uses a dual light setup like what Tommy has. I can just hang one light and then cast a spotlight on this tank, and then cast shadow on the other areas. So that method also works very well if you have a layout that has this, the bright plants in one spot and then irradiates out to lower light plants. Spotlighting is a method that also works well to kill off algae. Basically, if your light doesn't touch your glass, you won't get algae on the glass. Yeah. Another example from the internet. Difficult combination again, right? So he has some rocks. His tank is quite well planted, but most of these are not very competitive plants. It's just a carpet. But he made the choice of growing big plants. So this is where the choice of growing a single species can change the way the guy runs the tank. Without these red plants, the rest of his plants can grow well with like 40 pounds. To grow these red plants to a really good coloration, he probably needs about 100, more than double the amount of light that he otherwise would have used. And with that, the chances that you get your rocks green and then you get other forms of algae is increased greatly. The difference between 40 par and like 100 par is a huge difference on its impact on algae. For this tank, I will also use the strategy of dosing less NMP into the water column and relying more on the substrate. I think he hasn't dosed that much because his rocks are still clean. Yeah. But I don't think he's using that much light either because some of these plants are supposed to be red, but they are green. One more example. So this is from my gallery bag at home. Again, because I have a little slither of red plants at the back, I needed to use a little bit more light to bring out the color. Without this red plant, the whole tank can be grown with 40 to 50 par. So half of what I'm using right now. And that will make things actually much easier. So you can see a little bit of green on the bottom. I'm dosing the NMP into the watercolor for this tank because I wanted the multicolor to drip. And these they are not attached to substrate. They're just grown on the rocks. So sometimes if you are thinking about growing a certain species, the question to ask is it an outlier to the rest of your tank system? Are you sacrificing the entire tank stability just to have a bit of color? And is it worth it? Yeah. Oh, this is a little bit about lighting. So this is the same tank, but for these two I just took the household lighting I had lying around the shop. So this shows you the effect on visual coloration of the different lights. Yeah, so a lot of the household lighting, because of the spectrum curve, they are very deficient in red. So the red tones get very pale. Yeah, I brought up this slide because there was a guy that was growing plants using, I call it household lighting. So he asked like, how do I get my plants more red? Should I just buy the double amount of light? And the answer was no. No matter how much light of this type you add, this is the color that you're going to get. Right? So having like 500 par, but of a poor visual color spectrum, it doesn't show up the tank well. The correct way is to use less light, but one with the correct spectrum charts to show up the color. Yeah, so in choosing the equipment for our tanks, making the right choices prevent like runaway mistakes as well. Yeah. Okay, so this is my last slide for this segment of the talk. Do you guys have any questions on plants, algae?
How much are you using like Paragon and all this other kind of stuff?
I think Paragon works fine. Yeah. So Paragon is originally produced by CChem. Some people label it as chemical filtration, but I don't think that there's any reaction. So it is. There's a very thick one of you just now that I do some work for the local zoos back in Singapore as well. And actually public aquariums have some of the worst layouts because they want to have a lot of fish. They want bright light so that people can see the fish. And because the zoo is open for like 10 hours, right? So they want lights on for long hours as well. So the combination is very difficult to manage. Okay, so now I'm going to start on the aquascaping. This is a 10 gallon tank. So a little bit of my talk is how to make smaller tanks look bigger. This is bigger. This is a 65 gallon. So if you arrange it wrongly, you can make a big tank look small as well. Yeah. And this is one of the semi-dioramas that I had at my place years ago.
What happened to your pointer?
So in the previous presentation, we talked a lot about plant-only aquascapes. So in this one, we are going to talk all about hardscape. And the aim of my talk today is to give you guys some tips and pointers that will enable you to make the simpler scapes that are impactful. So I'm not going to cover the extremely complex dioramas because I think that among the hobbies in the world, a very small percentage of people actually work to create those. We have courses on those, but those take about 4 or 5 hours because it's much more technical. Instead, I want to talk about how do you use the materials in this room to create stuff that is simple but impactful. Because I think that this will be the most useful angle to approach this for most people. Like, I really like this tank. This is not mine, but it has a sense of perspective. And it has this sense of nature, even though it's something that is quite simple, right? So the guy doesn't have very complicated rock work. But yeah, very nice sense of nature in this. So I would like to start the presentation by asking what is natural? It's something that is actually quite hard to define, but I think for most of us, we have seen enough of nature that instinctively we can say whether something looks natural or not. And between these two examples, it's quite clear that this one looks unnatural, and this one, to me at least, it looks quite natural. But why? So some things I can pick out of is that, like for this one, his branches, it looks like it was stuck there, and none of the branches rhyme with each other. For this one, his branches match well, so it looks like they all come from the same setting. His planting is very even, so it looks like a plot of farmland. Whereas this guy, he has mixed species. So with the intermingling of species and shadows, the waving plants give a sense of water flow. So I do think that this tank looks much more natural than this tank. So this is a topic that I want to explore further, because I think one of the key things that people want to do with their tank is to bring a slice of nature in. And if you can get that element of nature in, whatever layout you do, you will seem to sit and flow more naturally. So the very first thing I want to talk about is about rock selection. If you have rocks of only the same size, especially if they sit against the substrate in a very stuck manner, it doesn't look natural. Nature has rocks of all sizes. If you have a huge stone, chances are, the rocks break down over time. So you get smaller pieces. And for most natural areas, the substrate color will actually be similar to the rock as well, because all rocks, whether deteriorate and break down over time. So the first thing when doing aquascaping is that you will want to find rocks where you can find a good range of sizes to eat. So I would recommend at least 3 different sizes, even though 5 is better. So this is a scene from one of my tanks back at home. I have large pieces of rocks, but I also have smaller pieces that blends the larger piece into the substrate. So this is an example where the guy has large pieces, but he doesn't have the small bits. So the rocks look like they have been placed there by the hand of man instead of occurring in nature. In this tank, I use a lot of small rock pieces to blend the larger pieces in. And for these larger pieces, you can see that they are half sunk into the substrate. So it sits a bit more naturally. If you have rocks where the edges can still be seen, such as this example, you can see that, oh, this rock, it just sits on top of the sand. Then it looks very, very unnatural. So the 2 key points. Smaller rocks are very critical. In the aquascaping competitions that I go to, some of them use this format. They call it a blind scape. Blind scape means that all the contestants are given piles of material. Then everybody will go snatch what they want. So the first thing that I look out for is, for the rock that I choose, is there this size gradient? Is there a big one, medium one, small one? Is there the chips? If there is not, is it a rock that I can break down with a hammer? If I can't do any of those things, I wouldn't choose that rock to use in the competition. Because using just rock of one size, no matter your skill level, it's very difficult to get it to work. Another example, look how cleanly the rock sits on this substrate. Right? So this looks very artificial. You know that the rock has been placed there. Whereas for this scape, the use of this is by Bao, so this is not my tank. She has managed to match the rock textures very well. And she has a lot of these smaller pieces. And she even has this smaller debris. Not only that, her sand actually uses the same curvature as the rock. So it's not a flat substrate. So this looks very, very natural. And she did this in, I think, 4 hours. Right? So you don't need a huge amount of time once you have the materials prepared. Next, I want to talk a bit about wood. So there's a difference between, I call it branches and sticks. So nice branches, later we'll walk around, then we'll see. I think nice branches has the size gradient from thick to thin, and nice branches divide. And if I can find these branches in the shop, these are very high value branches. Sticks are difficult to use, so they can be used in certain layouts. And sticks that are placed vertically can be used in the forest layouts, but these are much harder to use. Branches of uniform size. So basically, if you have a lot of these in a shop, your job is easier. If you have a lot of these, it's harder to use immediately. You may have to do a lot of shaping or creative layout to use this. So this is an example where this guy has more sticks. You can see the cut ends which look very artificial. Whereas this guy, he has these nice tapering branches that split naturally. So for this guy, I think this layout took a lot less effort. For this guy, he has to do a lot more shaping of the wood, or maybe he has to do mosses to cover up the cut ends for this layout to work. Branches also occur at the origin point. So we see the thickest at the main trunk that splits into smaller, thinner branches to yet thinner branches to yet thinner branches. So nature has this natural order. So all of us have some background image of it, so that when we look at the tree, we recognize it as being natural. And it's because it has these small rules of how it is ordered. So this is a tent where the origin point of the wood is random, right? So the wood randomly sticks out at different directions. So to me, it feels a bit unnatural. And this is one where there's an origin point, and the wood come out in the same angles. So you can imagine like this origin point where the trunk grew and then bent over. So to me, it looks more natural. Again, this one has nicer origin points. And the other technique that these guys use, these are not very nice branches, but he managed to get them to line up because he used a similar angle to them. So this idea that nature is full of repeated patterns on a different scale, as long as you repeat the patterns enough, you can fool the eye that, oh, this is something that happens in nature. If you are a bit too random, then it looks artificial. Yeah, so this idea of what are nature's patterns? Most of it is repeated patterns on a smaller scale, whether is it in leaves or branches. This picture on the left, it is just a zoomed out version of this picture on the right. But if we look at these two photos, we kind of recognize it to be from the same tree. So nature is this, it makes use of this idea that it has the same angles, but it's just repeated on a smaller scale. And if you can achieve that in your tank, then you can fool the eye into thinking that it's natural. This is a scape by an Indonesian aquascaper. So his trick is that he used the branches to all face the same direction. So it gives the impression of these windswept branches. And he has also nice variation from thick to thin. And he has also nice branching. Right? So even though this is an entirely artificial scape, the setup looks quite natural. The wood, no natural wood grows out of the ground like this. But he has managed to fool us a bit because he has this repeated pattern. And it takes 3 to make a pattern. So I think that if he just has 2 of them, it won't look so well. But once you have enough of a repeated pattern, the eye is kind of fooled into thinking that, oh yeah, this could happen in nature. Then you look at how he has managed his substrate as well. A mix of bigger and smaller pieces. And the substrate slopes upwards to the wood. It's not flat. Very nice variation of thick to thin. And again, here he pointed all the wood in the same direction to make it look like it is a tree top, fanning outwards. For you guys that are not so used to working with wood, I think this is a trick that you can apply immediately. So it is one that I use as well. Is that have all your wood point in the same angle for a certain bunch. And once the angle lines up, it'll look more natural. And it even works for rocks. So this is my hardscape from the tank before. I had all the rocks pointing at a similar angle, so it looks like they fan out from a certain origin point. Whereas for this guy, I think he doesn't have enough variation in his sizes. So he has the very big and he has the very small. But the gradation is very abrupt. it's not gradual. Like you need some small pieces to match. And his rocks are a bit random. I cannot find a strong enough repeated pattern to it. So nature is about ordered chaos. And this also applies to the way we plant our plants. Later we will look at some of Tommy's tanks. And I have some minor criticisms of it. Yeah. So for example, when we use moss, often we find that the moss doesn't grow everywhere on the tree. Quite often it may be on the shade side where there's more moisture. So if you look at a bunch of tree trunks, all the moss will be at one angle but not the other. So this is also a repeated pattern we can introduce to our tank to make it look natural. Same for ferns. Like these ferns, they tend to need a horizontal resting point. They don't grow on the vertical trunks as readily. So if you plant Java fern in your tank and you use it only on the horizontal branches where there is more surface, and you do this repeated pattern across your whole tank, it will make your tank look more natural. So let us look at this aquascape and think about what rules this guy made up. And they're all made up rules, right? Because none of these plants grow like this in the wild. But the rules are what makes the tank look natural. So this guy has a rule that he will have Monte Carlo on the higher level flat surfaces, and that the Monte Carlo will drip down. But he limited the Monte Carlo to the higher surfaces, and he did not use it on the lower areas as much. For Anubias, I think one of the rules he has is that the Anubias will always be against the substrate, against shadow. Right. So this is a rule that is repeated throughout the hardscape. Then maybe his next rule is that I think he makes the planting at the bottom. He gives it a bit of randomness, so it doesn't look like all the same texture. So that the variation gives it a bit more complexity. Then I think his next rule is that he has the colorful stem plants only at the back and then exposed to the light. This is a snapshot from one of my tanks. So the rule I use for this is that I would use the Bucephalandra on the light-facing areas, and I'll use the Anubias only in the deeper shade. Then I mix mosses. So I think that if you're going to do aquascaping, I think a very important plant to master is actually the moss. And why is moss so useful? Because moss does not require any substrate to grow. You can plant it on any surface, like even on verticals, on wood, on rock. You can even stick it to glass and it will grow there. And moss can take no light, so you can have a tank that uses less light so that you don't have algae. And mosses can also be shoved into the various nooks and crannies to hide the connection points between your hardscape. I think that a lot of people that are new to aquascaping, they tend to want to use rooted plants to finish the aquascape. But if you look at most of the competition aquascape, there's almost no rooted plants. For this guy, his rooted plants are only at the back where there's a bit of soil. He might have a pocket of soil at the top. But all this, 90% of the surfaces you see, is just wood and rock. So he has used plants that can be planted on wood and rock. And when you don't have a substrate, you can have a much more three-dimensional scape. Because you can plant on the rock surfaces, you can plant on the wood, you can plant on the horizontals, you can plant on the verticals. Most competition aquascapes will use a very big variety of mosses to have different textures. For this tank compared to this tank, why is this one so much more natural?
That's my tank.
Nah, it's not. It's my Giraffe. This
one on the left.
This guy is on time. Oh, you mean this one?
Yeah.
So there are a few things that we can pick out quite quickly, right? So this guy, his wood is too clean. This is a freshly planted tank, so it doesn't even have algae on it. This one has time to mature, and he pasted just a little bit of moss to give it a bit of texture. This guy, his plants occur in very distinct clouds. So they haven't had time to spread yet, and they haven't had time to intermingle with each other. This one, because he has used mostly moss and it's very blended, so it looks more natural. remember we talked about the small bits that need to merge into the substrate. This guy has a laser line between the rock and the sand. It's very, very artificial, very jarring to the eye. Just like his wood stands out, like the cut ends stand out a lot. So this looks very, very artificial. If you are submitting this time for a competition, they will probably crop the picture at this level so that not to show the cut end. So this is what this guy does. All the cut ends are above here, but for the photo, he cropped it up. The other trick that this guy used is that you notice all the woods are slanting at a slight angle that mirror each other. So it gives the impression that for this forest, all the woods are slanting, are going in the same direction. The other angle I'll talk about is the importance of shadows to give contrast. I think we don't notice this so much when we are doing the rock work because our eyes can see in 3 dimensions. But once you take a photo, a lot of tanks that you thought had rocks that were very big and 3-dimensional turn out to be very flat. And the way to accentuate the form of the rock is to find rocks that can cast some shadow. So this is a scape by Fukada that he did recently. The extremely steep contrast of the shadows with the lighter portions on top is what gives that dramatic contrast. Same for this one. Dark shadows, bright open areas. So that contrast is what gives the rock the 3-dimensional look. We see this in all the competition aquascapes. There will be areas of very deep shadow contrasted with areas that are brighter. So what happens if you don't have that? Even for iwagumis that use rocks, once you don't have enough shadow, your rocks will look very flat when in the picture. For just a slight tilt to give shadow on one side, gives the rock a lot more form. So like this guy has a lot of rock on his skin, right? But all the rocks have no shadow, so they kind of fade into the substrate. Compared to a scape that has shadow contrasted against the brighter areas, so that contrast comes out much better. Again, if you just put rocks without thinking about where they have deeper shadows, they don't appear. Yeah. So this one, he doesn't have the gradation in rock sizing, no shadows. So I think that the rocks add very little value in this tank. Okay, so the last element I want to talk about is the sense of scale. This one is a bit more technical because this one is used more specifically for dioramas. But even when we do our aquascapes, we can think about this concept a bit. These are a couple of pictures I took when I was mountaineering in Nepal. This is Island Peak, about 6,000 plus meters up. So this is the summit, and I took 2 photos. One when I'm standing slightly further away, and one when I'm directly on this ridge line. So which one has a better sense of depth? This photo was taken from further away, but to me this photo looks a lot flatter. And why does it look flatter? Because the difference in size of the humans on it is not a huge difference. Whereas for this photo, I can see that this guy is very near me, and this guy is very far away. So there's a huge difference of the sense of something is near, something is far. And we can apply that to the aquascapes as well. So this was I call it the way it was done in the past. People will put the bigger rocks in their tank towards the rear, and they will put the smaller rocks towards the front. Such a layout will give a lot of free swimming space for the fish. But to me, it doesn't give as good an illusion. After 2010, people begin experimenting with putting big hardscape close to the front glass. So if you look at this hardscape, this is a very big tank. I think this is 5 or 6 feet. Yeah. So this piece of wood is the size of my body, and it is a couple of inches away from the front glass in this area. This guy, he has strings tied onto this wood, onto the steel supports on top of the tank, just so that he can tilt the wood forward and get some shadow. But if you look at the tank itself, it is placed very close to the front glass. And that's because he wanted to contrast the big objects up front with the smaller details at the back. In both of these tanks, these are not super deep tanks. It's not like the tank is 3 or 4 feet deep. I think both these tanks, they are just the standard 2 feet depth. The difference is that they have big objects up front contrasted with the smaller objects in the distance. Yeah. So the big stuff at back versus big stuff at front. And we see this in all the competition aquascapes. So if you notice for the competition aquascapes, they will build the hardscape up to the front of the tank, the front corner. So it is almost similar to what Tommy is doing, but his one is not so forward. If this piece was stuck to the front glass, then you will get this effect. They will have this slope towards the rear vanishing point, and then a slope from front to back, and the slope will be very steep. For Tommy's tank, I think that their substrate will end here, so it is a very steep slope from front to back to get this sense of depth. Then they will layer the bigger hardscape, big wood up front, then medium wood, then the smallest wood will be at the back. For both of these tanks, these are standard 120p. So it's 4 feet by 1.5 by 1.5. So these are not super deep tanks. So this is purely an illusion. This is 90p. So this is my tank back at home. The difference in size between the biggest wood at front and the smallest one at the back is almost 50 times. So the wood at front will be like this. And I'll be using twigs at the back. And the substrate is elevated about 10 inches. So the slope is very steep. And remember we talked about the big rock and the small rock blend. So there's this blending effect as well, so that the rock sits on the substrate. Now the next question is, how do you maintain such a steep slope? Because if you look at the side of the tank, the slope is almost like this, like 45 degrees. The answer is, the slope is entirely glued down with super glue. So to finish this scape, I took about 1 liter of super glue. Yeah, so this entire surface up to here is just solid, it's glued down. And that's why we cannot use glued plant as well, because there's nothing to plant it. This is just a solid surface, it's an illusion. Then we will plant stuff that can be glued onto the rocks, the mosses, the Cephalandra and Herbias. And because everything is glued down, it doesn't move. You can maintain these scapes for a very long time. And if something goes wrong, I can remove all plants, I just bleach the hardscape, then I plant it back, and it starts like it's new. So the hardscape is almost like a, how to say this? It's almost like a fixed base that you can just arrange it as you can just plant it in different ways over time. This is another tank that I did. This wood is huge. This wood is, I think, this size of my torso. And the thinnest ones at the back, they are thinner than your finger. They are the thinnest branches that you can find in this shop. And the contrast between the front and the back, the big and the small, is what gives the sense of scale. This is a standard 3 feet tank. So this is 3 feet times 1.5 feet times 1.5 feet. So all this depth is achieved in the distance of about like that. Yeah. And it may not appear to have a slope, but this slope is about 7 inches compared to the front. So the slope is actually like this elevation if you look at the side of the tank. It's just that after you take the picture, it looks like it's flat. The sense of scale is also used by using smaller leaf plants. This is a very standard planting for competition aquascapes. The bigger leaves will always be used by the side, and only by the side. You'll find that for the most of the competition aquascapes, the center third will only use small leaf plants, and especially at the back. I think for one of my aquascapes, I use hair grass at the back. So it changes the idea, right? So we always think of carpets at the front, but to perpetuate the illusion of that, sometimes now we will plant the smallest plants at the back, and we will use the bigger stuff up front instead. This is 15 gallons. No, this is a 10 gallon.
10 gallon.
This is smaller than this. No, this is a 9 gallon.
That's a 17.
Yeah, this is a 9 gallon tank. all the small mosses, some bigger leaf plants in the front, and then just very fine leaf stuff at the back. Oh, this wood is resting against the front glass. So that's how much we have pushed the bigger hardscape to the front. So yeah, I talked about the slope. Yeah, so the difference between the back height and the front, I think for this is about 8 or 9 inches. So the substrate is also at this. And if you're wondering why there's no plants here, it's because this is all glued down. Yeah, so this is glued down. It's a bit, I don't have a picture of the construction before it's done, but basically this path becomes its own solid block in the middle, and I have soil on the side so that I can plant the plants in. Yeah. So if I took away the plants, you'll see pockets of soil here and here, but basically the rock and the path is glued down. And slopes are a must, even for scapes that use a rather flat substrate. So these two are iwagomis, but you notice how flat this one looks, and it doesn't look as good. This one, the slope is almost halfway up the tank, and because of the slope, it looks like the rocks come out naturally from the ground. So there's a slight slope here, and there's a slight slope here as well. Yeah, so even for iwagomis, having a substantial slope gives a much better presentation. You'll only see the huge difference in photographs. If you're just looking at the tank, because again we see in 3 dimensions and we can move our viewpoint, the flat slopes, the flat substrates don't look as bad in real life. Oh, so this is the other tank. So yeah, so this is all glued down. This is also a 9-gallon. But even for a 9-gallon, this is like 6 inches of slope at the back versus the front. Then again, I use the the bigger leaves up front. So for this plant bunch, it is within 3 inches of the front glass. Yeah. I'll show you some examples of extreme slopes. So this tank is interesting because I know the dimension of this tank. This is a 120p, so it's exactly 4 feet by 1.5 feet, right? 1.5 feet.
120 by 50 by 50.
No, not 50. This is 45. This is the old 120p.
That's 120L.
Yeah.
Yeah. 120 by 45 by 45.
By 45. Yeah. So this the depth is only 45 cm. So this is 4 feet by 45 cm by 45 cm. So this is wrong. This is not 50 cm. Because the whole height of the tank is only 45. But this guy has a tremendous slope. He sloped the tank like all the way to the top. So you can imagine if this was a tank, this slope would be like this. Very, very steep. But because of the extremely steep slope, he has this huge like canvas to layer the big rock, the medium rock, the smaller rock, the smaller rock. Then he even chased the fish to the end so that you get the illusion of that. His front rocks, I think, is like 1 inch away from the front glass. So if you look at this tank, very quickly you'll see the front rocks that are very close to the glass. Then it slopes very steeply to the back. So it gives this tremendous illusion of depth. The other thing you notice, all the big leaf plants are by the front or by the side. In the middle third, everything is small. Right, so the illusion comes from the side and the front towards the back. So Tommy, for your tank, you should remove the big leaf plants from the middle third. Right, so that is what I want to tell you about your competition tank as well. Some more examples, all the very steep slopes. Halfway up the tank, 3/4 up the tank. And they all use this standard format where the biggest pieces are on the side. And then it will have a gradation to the smallest one in the distance. Yeah, but we won't be doing this today. We have some courses to do diorama back at home, but this one will take about 4 to 5 hours. Yeah, so it's a longer course. So this one I have a diorama on how to construct the mountain pathscape.
He will come back for the advanced class another time.
So this one you get to see me live. And I'll finish them in about 3 to 4 hours. Yeah, so if you build fast, you can finish quite complex scapes quite quickly, but you need to glue very, very intensely. And for both these scapes, like this piece is touching the front glass, the front corners. Yeah. So we build it up very stiffly, and then we slope it to the back. Yeah, so that is the end of the presentation portion of this. Then we have some practical examples at the back of the shop. So we shall continue then. Do you guys want a shop